Welcome back, and it's time for The World This Week, where 4 journalists join me to chew the fat over what's been making headlines in the last 7 days. And this Friday, it's the turn of Christopher Dickey, the foreign editor at the Daily Beast. Thanks, Christopher. Elena, a journalist with the Russian service at our sister radio network RFI. Jean-Marc, a former France 2 correspondent and fellow Australian, albeit based here, like me, in Paris. Marc BURLEIGH, a journalist with Agence France Presse. Thanks to all of you for joining me. And you can also contribute to the discussion. Our Twitter hashtag is TWTW. And as we've been seeing here in France, it was a day of memories as a dwindling number of World War II veterans were joined by presidents, kings and queens to mark the 70th anniversary of D-Day. Political differences were seemingly set aside as they paid their respects to those who fought in one of the greatest battles ever seen in Europe.
What more powerful manifestation of America's commitment to human freedom than the sight of wave after wave after wave of young men boarding those boats to liberate people they had never met. And when the war was won, we claimed no spoils of victory. We helped Europe rebuild. Our commitment to liberty, our claim to equality, our claim to freedom and to the inherent dignity of every human being, that claim is written in the blood on these beaches. And it will endure for eternity.
France and the United States always reunite. Today, too, our countries are gathered to fight other threats: climate change, growing economic and social inequalities, underdevelopment, poverty, world hunger. Indeed, today, we're confronting together other perils, which we thought we'd never see again. Fundamentalism, racism, extremism, terrorism. That's why today's ceremony has a very significant dimension.
Very moving to watch, Christopher, and hindsight is always 20/20, but we take it for as guaranteed that it was going to be a success. There was also the fact that it could have failed, to the point that General Eisenhower apparently scribbled a failure speech the night before, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. It was really a huge risk, and I was at Colville today, Colville-sur-Mer, and as people were going over the history on the loudspeakers while everybody was waiting for the heads of state to come, there was a lot of talk about how much of a close thing it was, how easily it could have gone wrong, how the weather was very iffy, and the weather reports were very unreliable.
It was certainly not like today, which was sunny and glorious.
Well, no, it wasn't anything like today, and there was a question of whether it was just all going to go to hell in a handbasket, and it was an enormous, enormous invasion and operation, and if it had failed, it's hard to imagine what would have happened.
A massive logistical exercise.
Yeah.
A poignant day also, Jean-Marc, given this is probably the last time that we're going to see all those veterans together at a significant occasion.
I think it's very important. You see, most of the time, the young people I talk to, they see war on TV and as something that could never happen to them. That's something that's supposed to be restricted to foreign countries. And I think it's very important that they realize what happened in the old days, and that especially with the tensions reaching Europe at the moment, that war is a possibility every day of one's life, and then liberty and peace are something to be fought for every day, especially in times of peace. And so I looked at it with great emotions, and I have to say that also, as a former war correspondent, I was all the more moved that I realized the enormity of the event and the enormity of the casualties, even though I've seen many. And each time I think I am blasé, that my emotions become jaded, but they're not.
Elena, the Russians have a very different take on D-Day, don't they?
For me, it was the same thing. It was very important for me to see the ceremony. Of course, as a Russian, we are all connected. We have in every family we have death in this world war, and we discussed a lot. Should Vladimir Putin to be among all these a chief of states or shouldn't be? And it's very interesting because some people from Russian opposition, they was discussing how they will shake hands of a man who will invade Ukraine, but on the other hand, how he cannot be there. So it's very, very complicated, and already we saw and we heard a lot of criticism of President Obama from Russian side, because he didn't mention during Colville's speech, he didn't mention Russian army. He did it later on, but not at that speech on U.S. cemetery. So people from Russia, they was very, very upset and just a bit angry.
But as you grew up in Russia,
Yes.
what were you taught about D-Day?
What would I?
What were you taught about D-Day? What did they, how did they explain D-Day in schools?
Yeah, I remember that we saw many reportages in Russia in state TV, and we saw many Americans who was trying to explain that they won the war, they helped a lot, and Russian anchors was all the time very ironical, and they was laughing. You see, Americans won the war, but it was we who did it. So it was really interesting, because even now, we was discussing with Chris today on Russia Today TV channel. They put on air an expert from Germany who is saying that the war would be won even without allies. So they clearly make this message broadcasting again. So what I saw in my early childhood. So it's very interesting.
Elena, there's a tweet here from @Discorospolis who says Russia had the greatest share in defeating the Nazis and the greatest sacrifice, 26 million deaths. I mean, that is extraordinary. Mark, the other interesting thing about this today's event is that it's the first time we saw a national commemoration of civilian loss of life on D-Day.
Well, yeah, I mean, when obviously when it's a world war, you're talking about a massive amount of civilian casualties involved as well. It was an invasion coming over from, or a counter-invasion coming over from England into France, when you've got to what struck me, and one of the things I was looking at was to encourage, to enthuse the troops that were coming over. There was this message going around about how to relate to particularly French women, how to relate to the civilian society that they were moving into. I can't say that I know too much about the civilian commemoration that you were talking about, but just the fact that it was all encompassing. It was a world war that, essentially just moved things beyond the purely military theatre into a civilian
There was
theatre as
certainly
well.
a darker side to liberation, wasn't there, Christopher?
Well, I mean, sure. I was in Caen earlier today, and Caen was just leveled during the war. I mean, during the Allied invasion, they bombed the hell out of a lot of cities in Normandy, and to a lesser extent in Brittany. And, those Le Havre, for instance, was generations rebuilding it. And the people lived in desperate circumstances. In Caen, they had no food, there was no water, there was no services at all. There were a lot of people dead. It took some people 30 days or more to die with no treatment. So there was a huge amount of suffering, and it was inflicted by the Allies. Now, I think people at the end of the day felt it was worth it to be liberated from the Germans, but we can't pretend that it didn't happen.
What impact did that have on the population in Normandy?
I think the Normans I've known for many years are all extremely proud of their being Normans, and especially related to the war. You talk to people, and very often they go back to their fathers and to their relatives, or even to farms, and they'll show you part of the farm that still existed in older days.
They're rather stoic, aren't they, Jean-Marc?
Well, it depends. At times you have people who, for example, when you have political events in France that will create some kind of anti-Americanism, for example, during the war in Vietnam, you had people in Normandy that would say, well, after all, these Americans, all they can do is bomb. And then you would see some deeply buried anger resuscitate for a short moment, even if that was to be quickly forgotten.
Now, Mark, the British Queen is the only one who was alive as a young adult at the time of D-Day, And she's going to probably be the last head of state who has a living memory of that day.
And it's pretty remarkable. It's quite a span of a career for a monarch. I hope she's not looking too closely at Spain for where her future direction might lie.
There'll be more of that later.
I know there'll be more of that later. Yeah, we'll get into that later. But no, I mean, it's quite remarkable. I mean, she's like walking history now. What comes out for every celebration for Normandy, and this one in particular, is that, of course, she's of German stock. It's kind of interesting for someone in that, for a monarch where you have to represent sort of generations, centuries of history in one go. In a way, they kind of have to put into a drawer somewhere, hide behind a curtain somewhere, the whole German heritage that they have. That the irony, I suppose, in the end, that it was the Brits that went in and, like you said, leveled so many German towns and cities, but
and French towns and cities.
And French towns and cities, yes. But the fact that she would have to see this from a very broad historical point of view as well. It's going to be interesting in the future. I mean, can you imagine Prince Charles or maybe one of the younger princes who will be taking over doing this? That they'll, of course, coming from British royal family, they all have some sort of military training behind them, but it's not quite the same thing as being of that generation, of basically being a tunnel back to that time.
Elena, I mean, one of the interesting things now is that it's just a given that the Germans would send the head of state or a representative to these D-Day celebrations. It didn't always used to be the case.
I'm sorry, can you repeat this?
I was just saying that it was one of the things that is a given these days is the fact that the German Chancellor is there, and it's expected that they will be there. But there were many years where that wasn't really the case.
Oh, of course, for sure. And Angela Merkel did a lot today. I mean, during this meeting, she was the one who was President Hollande was next to Vladimir Putin and Petro Poroshenko supposed meeting. So she was there discussing with Nicolas Sarkozy, so who we will discuss later on, I think. And for us, it's important also. If you see how the invitation of Vladimir Putin was discussed in Russia, but they even invited German, why shouldn't they invite Vladimir Putin? Of course, we're very focused on Angela Merkel's presence here.
Christopher, this was probably a war driven by a moral imperative. In today's world, one may say that wars are fought for far more cynical purposes. Do you think the Americans or others would be capable of mustering such a coalition of enormous resources?
Well, thank God they don't have to. I think that big coalitions have been put together again and again since the war. The Cold War was all about huge coalitions against the Russians, basically. That wasn't a shooting war, but that NATO was put together so that this would already be in place if a war happened. If you think about the war against Saddam Hussein in the early 1990s, there was a very big coalition involved with that, with a lot of different and disparate players coming online to go attack Iraq. In fact, what's interesting is whenever the United States or Britain or Europe wants to say, we need a big coalition, they say that the enemy, whoever that may be, is just like Hitler. Yes. Because that is the sort of...
Well, actually, everyone uses Hitler as a boogeyman, don't they? I mean, Putin uses him against the Kiev government. I mean, Hitler is the boogeyman. No, I don't think...
Well, no,
so many people don't even know what fascism means.
He's very useful in that respect. He's useful for the Russians, because if you've lost 26 or 27 million people fighting this man, then if you can equate the protesters in the Maidan Square with Hitler, it has an automatic response in the Russian character.
But he's almost divorced from this strand of fascism. I mean, there are some things about the present Russian government you could say is fascist, but they'll never recognize themselves as that because they're not Hitler.
Elena?
That divorce is interesting.
It's very interesting how suddenly this word appeared on Russian television, fascist, with the Ukraine.
Everybody else is a fascist.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
Sure.
Of course. And even during this last interview of Vladimir Putin to a French journalist. I mean, he didn't say this exact word, but we heard what we felt what he's talking about, and for me it was rather surprising.
But you know, one of the strange things about all this discussion about Putin and the Russians and how many people were lost, it wasn't actually the Russians losing all those people. It was the Soviets,
yes, the Soviets
losing
exactly.
all those people. The reason Ukraine wasn't an independent country during World War II, and yet it was participating here because so many millions of Ukrainians died in the war. They played a role too, but now they're being given a separate identity.
But going back to what Annette was saying, the sort of moral imperative, this strikes me, the World War II, the rhetoric that we still carry around is that it was very much for freedom, for standing up for some higher principle. Wars these days are more about, people are very quick to say they're about oil, they're about supporting NATO. We've got much more down-to-earth goals.
Realistic or cynical reasons, possibly, Mark. Just quickly, Jean-Marc, this, in terms of this war, we are still living with the legacy. I mean, we saw that, you know, for 20 years plus there was the Cold War, and there's still a divide, whether we like it or not, as we've just seen, between East and West.
Well, yes and no. It takes time. You know, after what happened in the Soviet Union, and the great divide in the world, you know, you cannot solve problems like this quickly. We thought at one point that the economy would help, but the economy is not enough, even if it's a strong factor to prevent war, because the interests are so crossed that everyone needs the other as a partner. However, in terms of culture, there's still a wide divide between the Western Europe and Russians and the former Soviet states, because their history is totally negated in terms of they were from the Soviet Union, so their history is communism, or pre-communist history is not weighed in when we react to Putin's actions, be they in Crimea or in the Ukraine.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we're going to take a short break, but just press the pause button. I know you're going to obviously want to contribute further. Do stay with us. I'll be back here with my panellists for the second part of The World This Week.
My breath can scarce